So I hope you've had a go now yourself at practicing the classes and the IDs. If you've already done so, then you're in a good place to revisiting divs and spans, which we did talk about previously in the course, but I just wanted to talk a bit more about it now because combining divs and spans with the classes and the IDs is incredibly powerful, and if you want to be a good web developer, you'll need to have these tools in your toolkit. So essentially I just wanted to show you here what I've done, and then I'll show you how I've scripted that out. Essentially I've created a div here. So a div, to remind you, is like a block of elements. You can include as many different elements in a box. You can consider it like that. So as you can see, I've included a H1, a paragraph, and an image, all in this one box, and I've made sure that the background is red just to highlight that everything is contained within a box. And then we have a paragraph down here saying, hey, why aren't I colored? So you can see that something is existing outside of this box. So what's going on here? What I've done is I've put this into some HTML. Essentially, this H1, the paragraph and the image, you can see they're all inside a div. Now, if we just pretended that we weren't using a class for now, just to keep things simple, it's not going to work. The blue is still going to work because we're using a span, and span essentially is something you use within an element. So right now I'm using this inside a paragraph. But you can think of divs if they're not actually being styled. So one thing I could do, for example, because we only have one div on the page, I could just style it the normal way. I could just go div, background color, let's try again, background color, there we go, as red. This should work just fine. So there you go, as you can see, the div is colored red. Now, when we usually use a website, for example with this image, you can see we have lots of different boxes or blocks of elements going on here. So for example here we have a header that's probably got an image, a logo, and then maybe some text, and that's all within a div. So you've got divs around here, you've got a blue div here, and then a light blue div within that, and a green div within that. Essentially what I'm trying to say, without confusing you too much, is that a website, any website, is going to have a lot of different divs. Whether that's because you want to have them with a certain background color, or you want them positioned in the page somewhere, which we'll be getting onto in a future lecture. There are so many different things, or you might want it all to be underlined or indented. However you might want to style it, you're almost definitely in your website is going to have lots of different divs. So there's no point in just styling your div like this. And that's why it's so important that you start to get a bit more confidence in using these classes and using these IDs. Just to make sure that you're gaining confidence in this, let's create a class together for our div. So right now we have our div tags on either side of this, and we've included within it our header, our paragraph, and our image. We could include whatever we want in there. It could just be the H1 and the paragraph, for example. And just to show you, I'm going to move that outside of the div. Okay, perfect. So what we have here, we have a few elements within a div. That's all we've got going on here. Now, in order to style this div, we need to create a class. In order to create a class, we use the dot, like we went over in the last lecture. And for this one, I'm just going to give a very basic name, like color green. Okay, and then I'm going to put in some curly brackets, and then just give it a background color of green. Okay, so now I need to assign this class to the div. So I'm going to put class equals, what did I call it? Back green? No, color green. Okay. Color green. There we go. So now that I saved this, we've created a class, and if you remember from the previous lecture, a class can style any elements that have that style name, the class name. So color green, and then we've put in the class equals color green in the div tag. So let's refresh the page, and lo and behold, the green background, which we've put in here, for our class, it's now covering the header and the paragraph, not the image, because we moved the image out of the div. Now if I were to put the image back into the div, you'll see that it's all going to be background green. Even the little guy, this little paragraph under here, he's still not in there. So let's add him in there just for fun, so that he's not lonely. Perfect. And now they're all in the background. Let's take out these two. Let's take the paragraph out again. Okay, perfect. So finally, let's look into having spans. So a span, like I say, is kind of similar to a div, except a div contains a number of elements. Like here, the div contains the header, the paragraph, and the image. A span is used within an element. So most normally it's used within a paragraph. So in order to do this, we're going to create in order to style just this span, we're going to create another class. For good practice, we're going to create an ID instead. Now, any of you guys who have gotten a bit more confidence with using classes and IDs will rightly tell me that because we're only using this style once, color green, for best practice we should probably be using ID, because basically you want to be using an ID when it's only used once. You want to use a class when it's used multiple times. But for practice we're creating one class here, and we're going to create an ID. And so the ID, probably not going to call it ID, but hash, let's call it color yellow, because we haven't used that color in a while. Background color yellow. And what you might find nice when maybe you're scripting along with me, which is fantastic, or maybe you're doing it after the lecture, which is absolutely fine. But what will be nice is to realize sometimes that, okay, you're struggling with new concepts like the class and the ID, but what's really awesome is, doing the things now like creating the curly brackets and stating the background color and stuff like that. That's probably getting a bit smoother in your mind now, and you're able to do that a bit quicker. So it's awesome just to notice every now and then how you're progressing over time. So if you haven't given yourself a pat on the back yet, I recommend you do so, because you're doing great. So we've created this ID and we're calling it color yellow. Now we need to assign it to the span. So we just come in to the tag and we say ID equals, and then hopefully it will recommend it. Yep, color yellow. So now if we refresh, you will see that the span is highlighted yellow. So I know we've gone over quite a lot in the last two lectures, so I highly recommend that you do play around with creating more classes, more IDs, and trying to use these divs and spans in creative ways. See what works, see what doesn't work, and undoubtedly you'll get frustrated at some points, but that's all part of the learning process, so don't worry. What's really important is that you persevere and just keep playing around with it and be creative, have fun with it. See how in different ways you can apply divs and spans and classes and IDs. So just to go over, we have ourselves a class here, and classes are used to style a number of elements, but we don't want to style, for example, all of our images, all of our paragraphs. We just want to style specific ones. So that's really helpful. So we can create our class here using the dot and then a name of our choice, and then we can just assign it to any element we want. Here we did it with the div. We could very easily instead not assign the div anything, which will then make the div useless to us, but we could put the class in for the header instead, and you'll see we just have a background color of green. Same thing with the ID. You can use it in the exact same way, except the ID should only be used once in your script. So then in this lecture we've gone over divs and spans. So divs, you can think of boxes that can contain some elements. And right now I'm just using it to show you that, for example, in this div we could have everything in it with a background color. But you will see as we go on in future lectures that it can be used for so much more. And then we looked at spans, which have a similar concept, except they're not used to contain elements, they're used within an element, like a paragraph, for example. So, as I say, have a go with yourself, have a play, and then I'll see you in the next lecture.